been completely last before. It's quite a thing. Hello, everybody. Neil and I are about to give you a very high-speed run-through of what we might call a lightly enacted thought experiment. This is not an experiment actually carried out in a systematic way, but began as an interest in the idea of whether a practitioner code of ethics might be developed for learning analytics practitioners. And the lead on this project is Charles Lang from Columbia, who had to run out and get an earlier flight today and left us carrying the bag. So to a large extent, I must credit Charles with the originating idea and the legwork that was done in originating this project. So when I say code of ethics, I'm not talking about the big institutional wrangling kind of, oh my goodness, we have to cope with all kinds of possible data governance and ethics questions in our institution. The question that was posed in this project was really about a personal code. We know that these institutional codes are starting to be developed in institutions around the world, but they're really very focused on the institutional responsibilities, and they may not actually address what we, the little people, if you like, actually should be doing in our daily lives, or they may not assist in decision making on a day-to-day basis. That was the preamble. So Charles and then we with him said, so if these high-level institutional codes of ethics don't really address that stuff, I wonder if there's room for a personal or professional code of ethics, as there is in many other professional fields, that would help individuals align themselves with the ethical principles of the wider field. And if there was, what would that look like? A little tiny bit of background is that there are, in the world of codes of ethics, there are two flavors, really. There are the kind that are mandatory, that are prescribed by your profession, and that tend to be managed in some formal way by either a government body or some kind of professional organization that has the power, has kind of mechanisms of accountability to hold its members to account on these principles. The other kind of professional codes of ethics that you see out there in the world are known as aspirational. These are the kinds of codes of ethics that really are kind of statements of our best intent. These are the standards that we aspire to, that we hope that everyone in the field will live up to. They tend to be voluntary and so on. So that was one of the things in our mind. Should we be going for mandatory or aspirational? And we asked the questions, and we asked many people, why would we want to do this anyway? You know, what value would there be in having a personal or professional code of ethics? We got various answers, or we thought up various answers. Some people believe that having a professional code of ethics that applies to individuals is actually a mark of professionalism, of professional maturity of the field, and that brings your field in kind of in line in status with other high-level professional areas like law and medicine and accounting, and there are many others who have also evolved their own codes of ethics over time. Obviously, having a code of ethics is good practice generally, so there's a perceived value in just having some logical principles for behavior laid out. And especially with either mandatory or aspirational codes, there's the sense that having something articulated has the potential to positively influence behavior. So these are the kinds of ideas that we were thinking of. And then, of course, there's the real world that many of us live in, of messy and complicated educational institutions. And I'm sure you can all think of some of the challenges that might be difficult in trying to create any kind of coherent or unified professional code of practice. Institutions are decentralized often, and they tend not to like being given rules from some central unit to apply to everybody. They want to develop their own rules in their own corner of the institution. Generally, academics and educational units within bigger institutions are resistant. They don't like being they don't like being told what to do by other people. It's a part of the culture of education, I'm sure you're aware. We wondered if there's mismatch between these, or if there might be mismatch between the big institutional ethical codes that are evolving around data ethics and what people actually experience on a day-to-day basis in the profession. And others have asked us, maybe we're just not mature enough yet as a field to come up with anything coherent. All of which is to say, just like Mr. Selwyn this morning, we don't know the answers to these questions, but we talked about them and asked people questions like this. And so our paper and the 10 minutes high-speed talk that we're doing today are really just intended as a provocation to pitch these questions to you to see if you have thoughts about the value or otherwise, or possibility of a personal professional code of ethics. What Charles did to kick this off was to draft a code of ethics, version 1.0, and that's what I handed around to some of you. He looked at professional codes of ethics from other fields, and he borrowed and paraphrased some core principles to try and imagine what the principles of a code of ethics for learning and analytics professionals might be. And then he used that draft in his course at Columbia University with graduate students whom he is teaching to become learning analytics professionals. And he also sent it out to this was not done scientifically, and a random assortment of learning analytics folks like my colleague Neil and Sharon Slade at the Open University, and Paul Prinsloo in South Africa, and others many of whom may have been you may have met here, and asked them, what do you think? And they fall into some of these different kinds of professional areas. So out of the feedback that he gathered, we distilled for this little paper a few general themes of feedback, and Neil's going to talk about that.
So yeah, 3 main areas of results. First of all, resolving the possible conflicts between individuals and institutional priorities is highly complex, and it may take many years to sort that out, if ever. Sometimes abstract ethical principles may not actually offer concrete guidance to individuals. And if there are both costs and benefits from an algorithm, should it be used at all? Codified ethical practices may not actually help us weigh student wishes and needs against institutional priorities. And also the study found that individual practitioners in learning analytics may not have the power or the authority to actually influence how their institutions do anything. So, but we thought that an aspirational code of ethics might at least serve a function of inspiring discussion among the different participants. So that was the first area. The second area is to what degree, this is very bouncy, this platform, to what degree can individuals be held accountable? And abstract ethical principles will sometimes not offer any concrete guidance. So is a code of ethics even actionable given the scale and complexity of what's happening in institutions around learning analytics? There are multiple projects and activities and multiple stakeholders. That was the most common response from respondents. And also, can individuals take responsibility for downstream events? So things may happen many months after they've set up a project, for example. Can they really be responsible for what happens perhaps years later? And finally, can we even define generally acceptable behaviours in the area of learning analytics? And then, so as Leah said, we asked the participants whether they thought such a code of practice should be aspirational or mandatory. And the students, most of them thought it should be mandatory. Some of them thought it should be aspirational, and none of the practitioners thought it should be mandatory, not surprisingly, because we're working in the real world and we know how difficult it would be to enforce such a policy or a code of ethics. Who would enforce it? Some people thought it was premature to even have an aspirational code, let alone a mandatory one. We think the field is likely to remain divergent and decentralized, But we still think it's worth pursuing. And some of you got a copy of the draft Code of Ethics. It's also in the paper that's in the proceedings, so feel free to have a look at that, and we'd love to hear what you think. Thank you for listening.
Okay, well that is provocative. Let's have some reactions. What do you think? What would you sign up?
Hands up for mandatory. Hands up for aspirational.
Oh, that's positive.
Hands up for, nah, it's just too difficult. Yeah, yeah, the man who's really embroiled. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. The students were really clearly optimistic and, what's the word, idealistic, and thought that it would be a kind of badge of professionalism. That was one of the phrases used. But the professionals were much more jaded. John.
We've got, hold on a second,
sorry.
we've got a microphone here for John, and then Paul. Yeah, and
Go, John.
All right, I'll go. Have you looked at the work being done around AI codes of ethics at all and thought about how that might inform this? I'm thinking about, like, there's very strong work, it seems like, coming out right now and thought around, largely by tech companies, around Google's, the Facebooks, and others, around thinking about things. And they have things like disparate impacts, right? Looking at the training of AI and how that might affect negatively upon certain populations is being a required element of what they do. They're all aspirational, but they seem very similar to some of the things that we should be looking at. They're just a little more pointed because of the technologies being used. Have you looked at that or thought about that?
No, I think Charles's original focus was very much on the professions, as the old professions, and those were the models that he used in this first draft. But what you say sounds like it makes a lot of sense. I believe the Association for Internet Research also has some kind of code of ethics, so I'll store that for future reference.
Yeah, I'll send a couple of references because we've been looking at that around AI and ethics in education and convene people together because we're kind of having to. So it's think about
or crowdsourcing.
Thank you.
That's
Yeah.
great. Let's see.
Someone else? Yep. Hi. I really like the draft Code of Ethics. Further up, yes. So we tried putting out some ethical guidelines, and they're really sort of intended as a means for people to start thinking about some of the things to consider, but we haven't evaluated the impact of that at all. And one of the things that I'm sort of just wondering about is, whether or not it's aspirational or mandatory, but just sort of getting them aware of these aspects of ethical practice. How does that impact on, say, their consequential thinking when they analyze, interpret data, or design using the data?
I missed a key part of that last bit when someone coughed. Sorry. How does that impact on?
Consequential thinking in
Right.
that process of using data to make inferences, to design or sort of enact certain actions on the basis of their inferences, for instance. So in doing so, do they reflect on certain aspects of ethical practice where if they didn't have that, is that less likely or more likely to occur?
I think my interest in this, sorry to
No, go for it.
right in. My interest is in the idea of whether having something like this in the background kind of just holds the space to remind you to think about these ideas, and I suppose that's the idea of an aspirational code, I suppose, to keep the issues higher up in the cortex.
Yeah, I think a mandatory code is just going to be quite blatantly unenforceable, really, because of the disparate nature of the field and the way that universities and other educational institutions work. But just having something there, as Leah says, to refer to, perhaps you get a new project or activity coming along and you can map that against the code of practice and see how it looks. That's how we probably see it as being
Very
most
nice.
useful.
Thank you.
Speaking of
I know.
Sure.